Let me tell you what happened on January 15th, 2026, in the White House briefing room, because I think it matters. I think it matters more than most people are treating it, and I want to make sure you understand exactly what went down, not the spin, not the viral clip stripped of context, but the full, documented, factual picture of what this administration did in front of cameras, on the record, for the whole country to see. A reporter walked into that room. His name is Niall Stanage. He's a columnist for The Hill, not MSNBC, not The New York Times, not some progressive blog. The Hill, a publication that covers both sides. He sat down, he waited his turn, and when Karoline Leavitt called on him, he asked a question, a simple question. And the question went something like this. Secretary Noem said, earlier today, that ICE agents are doing everything correctly. 32 people died in ICE custody last year. 170 U.S. citizens were detained by ICE. And Renee Good was shot in the head and killed by an ICE agent. How does that equate to them doing everything correctly? That's the question. That's it. He read numbers back to the press secretary. Numbers that are documented. Numbers that the government's own data supports. Numbers that are not in dispute by any serious analyst, any fact-checker, any independent researcher looking at this. 32 deaths. 170 American citizens, people with the same passports as you and me detained by immigration enforcement, and one woman named Renee Good, a 37-year-old mother, shot in the head on a residential street in Minneapolis. He asked, how is that doing everything correctly? And Karoline Leavitt, the press secretary of the United States of America, speaking from a podium in the White House, on behalf of the president, turned it around on him. She asked Stanage why he thought Renee Good was killed. He said his view was that an ICE agent acted recklessly and killed her unjustifiably. And she looked at him and said, "Oh, okay, so you're a biased reporter with a left-wing opinion." Then she said, "Yeah, because you're a left-wing hack. You're not a reporter. You're posing in this room as a journalist." And then she said, and this is the part I want you to sit with. You and the people in the media who have such biases but fake like you're a journalist, you shouldn't even be sitting in that seat. She never addressed the numbers. She never said the death count was wrong. She never said the 170 detained citizens was wrong. She never disputed a single statistic. She attacked the man who read them aloud. And then she moved on to the next question. I want us to think about what that actually means, because I think we've become so accustomed to this kind of behavior that we treat it like background noise. We share the clip, we dunk on it on social media, and then we move on. But I'm asking you today not to move on. Not yet. Because what happened in that room wasn't just a bad look. It wasn't just a press secretary having a bad day. It was a window into something that should alarm every single American, regardless of party, regardless of ideology. When a government official refuses to answer factual questions about the conduct of its own enforcement agencies when they respond to data with personal attacks, that's not spin. That's not messaging strategy. That's the behavior of a government that has decided it does not need to answer to you. Let's back up and talk about Renee Good, because she deserves more than a statistic. Renee Good was 37 years old. She was a mother. On January 7th, 2026, ICE agents were conducting operations in a residential neighborhood in Minneapolis. What exactly happened in those final moments is contested. The Trump administration says she used her car as a weapon. Video evidence circulating online, which people across the political spectrum have analyzed, tells a more complicated story. What is not contested is that she is dead. What is not contested is that a CNN poll, taken after her death, found that 56% of Americans, a majority, believe the shooting was an inappropriate use of force. What is not contested is that the majority of Americans, 51%, now say that ICE actions are making cities less safe. Only 31% say ICE is making cities safer. Those numbers come from Republicans' supposed best issue, immigration. The issue that Donald Trump has built his entire political identity around. The issue that Karoline Leavitt thinks she's defending when she calls a journalist a left-wing hack. And right now, 61% of Americans disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of it. 61%, with 38% approving, on his best issue. So let's be clear about something. This White House isn't melting down because the media is being unfair. This White House is melting down because the reality of what ICE is doing in American neighborhoods is finally breaking through the propaganda wall they've spent the better part of a year constructing. And what a wall it has been. The Washington Post obtained thousands of internal ICE chat messages. Thousands. And what they reveal is an agency that has been, in their own words, obsessed with going viral. ICE's Public Affairs Division, a team they call VISCOM for Visual Communications, was embedded with agents in the field, filming raids, filming arrests, filming operations day and night, specifically to capture what they described as cinematic moments. Any video producer who witnessed something that looked good on camera was expected to flag it immediately, so it could be edited and posted to social media. The goal was viral content. And here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. In May of last year, the White House asked whether a video of a deportation flight out of Texas could be re-edited. Why? Because, in the words of someone at ICE, the clips don't feature tons of females. An ICE official confirmed that a producer would re-edit the B-roll to exclude the females. They were literally editing women out of deportation footage because it didn't fit the tough guy narrative they were trying to sell. They were also posting footage that contained clear errors using videos filmed thousands of miles from where operations were actually taking place. Misleading footage, presented as documentation of real enforcement actions. The Washington Post had previously reported on this, and when called out, the response from DHS was to accuse the media of lying. This is the information environment that Niall Stanage walked into on January 15th. This is the context in which he had the audacity to read government statistics out loud and ask whether they were consistent with the claim that ICE was doing everything correctly. And this is why the response from Caroline Leavitt was not an accident. It was not a lapse in professionalism. It was strategy. Because when your entire operation is built on curated imagery, on re-edited footage, on social media optics designed to tell a specific story, the last thing you can afford is someone in the room introducing actual data into the conversation. Let's talk about that data, because it really is astonishing. The Trump administration has, from day one, insisted that its immigration crackdown is surgical, targeted, that they are going after the worst of the worst. DHS literally created a website with that name, Worst of the Worst. Murderers, traffickers, gang members. That's the pitch. That's what they've been selling. And for a while, a lot of Americans bought it, because who wouldn't support deporting violent criminals? That's not a controversial position. That's not left-wing. That's just basic public safety logic. But here's what the internal DHS documents show. CBS News obtained an internal Department of Homeland Security document, not a leak from an advocacy group, not analysis from a think tank, an actual internal government document. And that document shows that less than 14% of the nearly 400,000 immigrants arrested by ICE in Trump's first year back in office had charges or convictions for violent criminal offenses. Less than 14%. That means more than 86% of the people swept up in this crackdown did not have violent criminal records. FactCheck.org analyzed the data and found that in January 2026, only about 29% of people detained by ICE had criminal convictions at all, compared to 64% during Biden's last full month in office. The Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, not a left-wing organization, a libertarian one, analyzed non-public data leaked to them and found that among those with any criminal convictions, only about 8% were convicted of violent or property crimes. And as the analyst there pointed out, that includes things like someone had an altercation at a bar, not rape, not murder, a bar fight. The American Immigration Council put out a report showing that arrests of people with no criminal record surged by 450% in Trump's first year, 2,450%. The share of people in ICE detention with no criminal record went from 6% in January 2025 to 41% by December. In 1 year. and the total number of people held in ICE detention rose nearly 75%, climbing from roughly 40,000 to 66,000, the highest level ever recorded in American history. Meanwhile, Congress has authorized $45 billion in new detention funding. $45 billion. The report warns that the detention system could more than triple in size over the next 4 years. So the question Niall Stanage was really asking, the question underneath his question, is this: if ICE is doing everything correctly, why are the numbers so radically inconsistent with everything the administration has claimed about who they're targeting? Why does the data say one thing while Kristi Noem says another? And rather than answer that, Karoline Leavitt called him a hack and moved on. I want to say something about the 170 American citizens who were detained by ICE, because this number keeps getting glossed over and it should not. 170 Americans. People who were born here, or naturalized here, or whose legal status is documented and verifiable, detained by immigration enforcement. The American Immigration Council's report profiled several of them. There was a green card holder, a father of 2, detained at an airport because of a past conviction he had been told by authorities would not jeopardize his legal status. ICE then neglected his medical issues for months while he sat in detention. There was a DACA recipient who was detained following an unrelated criminal arrest and then transferred repeatedly across the country as ICE searched for available bed space. He witnessed consistently poor conditions at multiple different detention facilities. These are not hypotheticals. These are documented cases. And when a reporter stands up in the White House briefing room and says 170 U.S. citizens were detained by ICE, he is talking about people like that. He is asking, is this what doing everything correctly looks like? The answer Leavitt gave was, shut up, you're a hack. Let's talk about what happened in Minneapolis, because you cannot understand why that briefing exploded the way it did without understanding the pressure the White House was under that week. Minneapolis had been building toward a breaking point for months. ICE had launched what they called Operation Metro Surge, a massive enforcement sweep through the city and surrounding area. By January 19th, DHS was claiming more than 3,000 arrests, and in the middle of all of it, on January 7th, Renee Good was killed. Then on January 14th, the day before the press briefing, an ICE agent was ambushed and hospitalized during an attempted arrest. The agent fired his weapon, hitting the suspect, a Venezuelan national, who survived. Protests erupted across the city. The situation was on the edge of something much worse. And Donald Trump, rather than trying to calm things down, threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act. He threatened to deploy federal troops to Minneapolis. Governor Tim Walz went on record and said, "Let's turn the temperature down. Stop this campaign of retribution. This is not who we are." Trump did not turn the temperature down, and Karoline Leavitt walked into that briefing room with all of that pressure, all of that chaos, all of that documented failure, and her response to legitimate questions about it was to go on offense against the press. She held up a picture of allegedly vandalized ICE vehicles. She invoked Laken Riley and Jocelyn Nungaray, victims of crimes committed by undocumented individuals, and accused Stanage of never having read about them. She performed outrage, and she skipped over every single number he raised. Now, to be fair to the administration, and I think it's important to be fair, because if we're asking them to deal in facts, we have to deal in facts ourselves. There are real criminals who have been arrested through these operations. DHS has documented gang members, traffickers, people with serious violent convictions. That is real. That is not manufactured. And no one on the left is arguing that those arrests were wrong. The argument, the one Stanage was making, the one the data supports, is that those cases do not represent the totality of what is happening. That the administration's own numbers show that the overwhelming majority of people being swept up in this crackdown are not violent criminals. That the worst of the worst framing, while not entirely fictional, is being used to justify an enforcement apparatus that is, in practice, targeting a much, much broader population. And that 32 people died in custody while that was happening, and that 170 American citizens got caught in the net, and that a 37-year-old mother is dead on a street in Minneapolis. Those things can all be true simultaneously. The PR offensive doesn't erase the numbers. The viral videos don't bring Renee Good back. I want to spend a moment on what the oversight situation looks like right now, because this is the part that I think gets the least attention and deserves the most. The Trump administration has not just been expanding ICE, it has been systematically dismantling the oversight structures designed to keep ICE accountable. The DHS Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, the internal watchdog specifically tasked with investigating abuses, has been cut by 85%. 85%. The DHS Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman, an office that Congress specifically created to oversee the ICE detention system, has been slashed by 90%. 90%. Think about what that means in practical terms. The detention system is the largest it has ever been in American history. The number of people in ICE custody is at an all-time high. The proportion of those people without criminal records is rising dramatically. Deaths in custody are at record levels. 2025 was the deadliest year in ICE detention history, and by January 15, 2026, 4 more people had already died in just the first 2 weeks of the new year. And the offices whose job it is to investigate these deaths, to audit these facilities, to hear complaints from detainees, those offices have been effectively gutted. This is not an accident. You do not accidentally cut your internal watchdog by 90% while simultaneously expanding the system it's supposed to watch. That is a choice, a deliberate, documented choice. And when a reporter asks whether ICE is doing everything correctly, given all of that, the question isn't partisan, it's constitutional. It's the most basic form of accountability journalism. And the response it got was, "You're a left-wing hack." Now I want to talk about Congress, because this story doesn't end in the briefing room. As of February 15, 2026, the Department of Homeland Security has shut down. No DHS funding. The third government funding lapse of this Congress, and it happened because Democrats emboldened by polls showing broad public support for ICE reforms refused to advance the DHS funding bill without accountability measures attached. What did they ask for? Court-issued warrants before agents can enter private property. Clear identification and badge numbers for agents. Limits on masks, because right now, ICE agents can and do conduct operations with their faces covered, with no visible identification, in violation of every standard we hold for local law enforcement. Expanded use of body cameras, new use of force standards, and independent investigations of shootings. That's the list. Court orders before entering homes, name tags, cameras, independent investigations when someone gets shot. These are not radical demands. These are the baseline standards that apply to your local police department. These are the reforms that the American public, 61% of whom disapprove of Trump's immigration handling, have been demanding in poll after poll. The White House called this a Democrat-driven shutdown and accused Democrats of taking critical services hostage. Meanwhile, ICE received $75 billion in Trump's big legislative package, meaning immigration enforcement continues even during the shutdown. The only thing that shuts down is the oversight, the accountability, the infrastructure around it. Tom Homan, the border czar, announced that the surge in Minneapolis would end a step the administration hoped would unlock a short-term funding deal. Kristi Noem announced body cameras would start being deployed in Minneapolis. But these concessions came only after Renee Good was dead, after Minneapolis was on the edge of martial law, after a shutdown, after weeks of pressure from polls, from journalists, from the streets. And even with those concessions on the table, the DHS remains shut down. Because when you strip away the noise, the fight is really about one question. Does the public have a right to know what is being done in their name? Does Congress have the authority to set standards for how federal agents conduct themselves? Or does this administration get to operate ICE as it sees fit, with no warrants, no identification, no cameras, no accountability, and no one allowed to ask questions on penalty of being called a left-wing hack in front of the world? Let me talk about what I think is the most underreported part of this entire story. The polling. Because the polling is catastrophic for this White House, and it explains more than anything else why Leavitt lost her composure in that briefing room. Immigration was supposed to be Trump's unassailable stronghold, the issue where he had built a political fortress. For years, Republicans have pointed to polling on illegal immigration as proof that they owned the issue. And early in Trump's second term, those numbers held up. People wanted border security. People wanted enforcement. The administration used that support as a mandate to expand ICE operations beyond anything we'd seen before. But here's what happens when enforcement stops being theoretical and starts appearing on people's phone screens. When it's not an abstract policy debate, but actual video footage of agents in masks dragging people out of cars in residential neighborhoods. When it's a name, Renee Good. When it's a number, 170 American citizens detained. When it's 32 people dead in government custody. The AP poll, taken entirely after Renee Good's killing, showed 61% disapproval on immigration, a record. The CNN poll showed 56% saying the Minneapolis shooting was an inappropriate use of force. Gallup found that the share of Americans who say immigration is a good thing for the country leapt to 79%, a record high. About 62% of Americans said they disliked how Trump was handling the issue. And this is what Karoline Leavitt walked into on January 15th. Not just a reporter asking a hard question, but a political reality that the White House had no good answer for. The data was real. The deaths were real. The detained citizens were real. The polls were moving. And the only play left, was to shoot the messenger. I've been thinking about what Niall Stanage did in that room, and I want to give him credit, because it would have been easy not to do it. It would have been easy to soften the question, to ask about ICE's challenges, to frame it in a way that gave Leavitt an easier out, to absorb the deflection and move on. That's what happens a lot in that briefing room. You ask, they spin, you move on. He didn't move on. When Leavitt challenged him back when she asked why he thought Renee Good was killed, he didn't hedge. He said what he believed, what the evidence supports, that an ICE agent acted recklessly and killed her unjustifiably. He said it clearly, on camera, knowing what the reaction would be. And when she called him a hack, he asked, "What do you want me to do?" Not defensively. Genuinely. What is the acceptable behavior here? What is the approved way to ask about 32 deaths? What is the non-biased framing for the detention of 170 American citizens? She had no answer, because there isn't one. There is no framing that makes those numbers disappear. There is no tone of voice that turns 450% more arrests of people without criminal records into doing everything correctly. There is no version of the question that the White House is prepared to answer. Honestly. Because answering it honestly would require admitting that the operation is not what they said it was. That the worst of the worst framing is a marketing slogan, not a policy description. That the gap between what they claim and what the data shows is not a communications problem, it's a reality problem. And reality, it turns out, is the thing that press secretaries are least equipped to handle. I want to close by talking about what I think is actually at stake here, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is just about a bad press briefing, or a viral moment, or partisan score settling. It isn't. What is at stake is whether we still live in a country where the government is accountable to the people it governs, where oversight means something, where the agencies that carry out federal law are subject to scrutiny, to standards, to consequences when they kill someone or detain an American citizen without justification, where a journalist can walk into the White House and ask a question about documented deaths and documented data and get a response that engages with the substance of the question rather than trying to destroy the credibility of the person asking it. I know there are people who hear 32 deaths in ICE custody and think, they were here illegally. What did they expect? And I understand that feeling, even if I disagree with it deeply. But I want those people to think about the 170 American citizens, people who were here legally, people who were detained anyway. Because when an enforcement apparatus gets big enough, and powerful enough, and unaccountable enough, it doesn't stay contained to the people it was originally aimed at. It never does. That's not ideology. That's history. That's the documented pattern of what happens to institutions that lose their guardrails. The DHS oversight offices weren't gutted for no reason. The body cameras were delayed for no reason. The warrants weren't required for no reason. Each of those decisions made it easier to operate without scrutiny, and we are now seeing, in real time, what happens when an enforcement agency operates without scrutiny. We're seeing it in the data. We're seeing it in the deaths. We're seeing it on the streets of Minneapolis. And we're seeing it in a White House briefing room, where the press secretary of the United States cannot answer a question about government statistics without calling the person who asked it a left-wing hack. That is not strength. That is not confidence. That is not the behavior of an administration that believes its own story. That is the behavior of people who know the data doesn't support their narrative and have decided that the solution is to make sure no one asks about the data. Niall Stanage asked about the data, and the White House collapsed.